Welcome to this public lecture organized by the Australian Association for the Study of Religion and the Christian Research Association. We're very pleased to have you here today with us. I also want to give thanks to the Catholic Theological College for providing us with this venue, and Solar Cafe for the provision of afternoon tea, which I hope all of you will stay on and mingle with us today. So my name is ensued, and I represent the Australian Association for the Study of Religion. And we have Stephen Philip here with me today from Christian Research Association. So I would like to begin today's lecture by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands and skies on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. As we come together for this lecture through virtually and physically constructed places across time, I pay my respect to the elders and ancestors who have cared for the country, and to all of you who are online as well, whichever country you join us from. Ancient places where education, innovation, knowledge transfer have taken place for thousands of years. I acknowledge that Aboriginal sovereignty has never been ceded on these lands, and I acknowledge that the gravity of the work needed to be done to undo the continuing impacts of colonization committed in these lands. May we continue to tread softly and gently on these lands, and as educators and researchers to work for the flourishing of all. May we continue to learn the history of these lands. May we continue to care for country, and country will care for us. So it is my great privilege to invite Heidi Campbell, who is Professor of Communication, Affiliate Faculty in Religious Studies, and a Presidential Impact Fellow at Texas A&M University. She's also Director of the Network for New Media, Religion and Digital Culture Studies, and a founder of the Digital Religion Studies. So if you think digital religion, you think of Heidi. That's how important she is to us. She has done a lot of award-winning research that focuses on the intersection of technology, religion, and digital culture. And she is the author of many articles, over 100 articles, dozens of books, with the latest one published in 2021, I believe, on digital creatives and rethinking religious authority. And of course, she has, made dozens and thousands, perhaps, of media appearances. So thank you, Heidi, and I shall hand the buck over to you.
All right. Hello, and thank you so much for having me, or as they say in my neck of the woods, howdy. Today I'm going to be talking about some research that I've been working on for the last few years, and a common experience that all of us probably have been impacted by the pandemic and its interaction with technology. So I want to start with giving a few comments on just the context in which this is, and most of the research that I'm going to be sharing today is based in the North American context. So I'll be interested during the conversation and the Q&A to how this kind of resonates with some of your experience as well as some of the things. But the US and North America is in a very interesting moment right now. And the question of kind of religion and technology has become very prevalent and important because it's seen as, is this something that maybe be able to kind of stay or hold back some of the tides of change that we're experiencing? So right before the pandemic, the Pew Religion Project, which is a really big research project in the US, did a study and came out with a study that said that the fastest growing religious group in America was not the mainstream, it was not the Catholics, it was what's called the nuns. Some of you may have heard of this term. This is not the N-U-N-S of the Catholic Church. This is the N-O-N-E-S. So people who are either affiliated with no religion specifically, or may say, hey, I'm spiritual, but I don't connect with a specific religious denomination. And so this was really kind of startling. It was the first time in the last 100 and some years of data being collected to find out that it wasn't a certain denomination, Protestant or Catholic, that was kind of being the most fruitful. It's this new generation. And also what happened in that research study is they identified a new group of people, and it was they called them the Duns. People who are Duns are people who are still would be happy to say, hey, I'm Christian, I'm Jew, I'm Christian, I'm even have a Catholic or Baptist or a Methodist identity, but I'm done with the institution of the church. And so this, again, especially as the pandemic has come across and as we're looking at the tail end of the post-pandemic future, scholars like myself are paying a lot of attention to. So, again, the pandemic hit, and the Pew came out with some studies during the pandemic about how different religious groups were impacted. And one of the things they came out with was in early 2023, and then they kind of did a update in mid-2023, and they found that 20 to 40% of people who were in the pews pre-pandemic are no longer in the pews. Right now, it's probably about 20 to 25%, but this is especially for mainline denominations in the Catholic Church, is very significant. And this leads to the kind of latest statistic I just want to start this talk with, that the Pew Foundation came up with a study they published recently, early this year. And they said within the next 20 to 30 years, America will no longer be a Christian majority nation. Now, for people in Europe, people here in Australasia and Australia, you have kind of maybe been in a culture that's had that kind of demographic for quite a while, where the church isn't the major voice in society. But for the U.S., this is a huge kind of identity crisis, as well as a moment to kind of think about what happened during the pandemic, and when the things that did happen during the pandemic, were these just kind of basically shining a light on trends that had already been happening, or is there something unique that happened over the last 4 years? So I just give this as a context, as a way to kind of think about some of the things I'll be talking about. What I'm going to share in this research study is I'm going to share a combination of work that I've done looking at churches and technology between 2020 and 2023, as well as a colleague friend of mine, Aaron Spiegel, who's been studying Jewish congregations. And we're going to look at, what did COVID-19, the pandemic, teach religious congregations, broadly speaking, about the institutional relationship to technology. I like to think about the pandemic as the forced digital experience of the experiment of the church. Many churches had been resisting, websites, social media, and whatnot, and they were faced with this moment where they had to engage, whether they liked it or not. And I also want to look at kind of this idea of, what do digital congregations look like now? What could they look like in the future? And might this be this move of going hybrid, of having an online, offline presence? Could this, stay the tide of some of the trends that we're seeing in the US right now? So the overview we're going to go over 4 sections. First, I'm going to introduce you just to the methodology of the research project that I've been working on about studying congregations during the pandemic. Then I'm going to share some data on our research study and some of the trends. And then I'm going to parallel that with some of the data that has come out of my colleague's project on Jewish congregations, so we can see what some of the similarities are. And then I want to end up talking about the future of kind of online religious gatherings, especially in this digital age. So let's start off looking at kind of the studying of religious congregations during the pandemic. In 2020, I was actually approached by the Lilly Endowment, which is a large funding body. They're connected to Lilly Pharmaceuticals. If you have heard of Ozempic, I benefited from the profits of Ozempic for this research. But they're have a branch of their endowment that is focused on studying as well as funding religion research. And so they have partnered with a place called the Center for Congregations, which is based in Indianapolis, just a few blocks away from their company headquarters. And this is a center that is really kind of does resourcing of congregations, especially in Indiana. And early on in March 2020, the Lilly Endowment and the Center for Congregations gave away about 2,800 grants of about $5,000 to churches in Indiana. Many of them, again, not having even Wi-Fi connections in their church or even an update camera, realizing if they were going to kind of, weather the pandemic, they were going to need resources. And so they asked me to come alongside these groups and basically follow them, not just in 2020, but over the next couple of years to see how did technology change what they were doing. And so we looked at a number of different congregations, mostly kind of mainline Protestant denominations. And over these 3 years, we focused on 3 different phases of research. One was every group that got one of these grants, they were asked to kind of come together and with members of my team as well as members of the Center of our congregation, we did these tech talks. And they're part of it was just asking technological questions about hey, is Zoom better than YouTube for streaming different things? But they had 50 different of these sessions, and we transcribed and took notes from them. And we were able to kind of find out not just the tech issues they were struggling with and the tech choices these congregations were making, but also kind of just how religious leaders were feeling at that early point of the pandemic. So that was the first part of the data, really hearing from the leaders. The second stage of analysis was we took all the initial grant applications that they got, where they had to write a narrative, not just what technology they needed, but why they thought they needed it and what they thought they would do with it. And we paralleled that with the final reports about what they actually did, and did a content analysis of those. So we had that second bit of data. And then the third bit, in early 2023, we did a survey, surveying all those congregations again, saying, okay, where are you at right now, and trying to find out what has kind of changed and what has stayed consistent. So that's the kind of data that we're dealing with. It was again multi-layered and a multi-methodological project. So if today, you're interested in some of the specific statistics that I'm going to present, I encourage you to go to our project research website. It's www.techinchurches.org. And so here it has more information about kind of the project that I just told you about, the methodology, as well as links to all the reports and papers that we've written and news kind of coverage that we've gotten for some of the research, but that. And also, if you're interested, kind of at the beginning of this project, my team and I put out a few ebooks, and these are free ebooks, to look at different aspects of the pandemic in churches. So the Distance Church was written in early 2020, where pastors and leaders were commenting in collaboration with research scholars about what they need to understand about the church being online. Religion in Quarantine was religious studies scholars basically asking from different religious denominations and communities, how are they adapting to the pandemic? And then Digital Ecclesiology was our first kind of attempt to get a group of theologians together to kind of reflect on what are the theological challenges that were coming up in that early part of the pandemic. So these are all kind of background resources. So just kind of, broadly speaking, this kind of research project that we did, we were looking at, how do we understand this idea of gathering and the church being a community when online is the only option. We wanted to look at, that a lot of people, especially early in the pandemic, reported that there was an expanded reach, at least when they saw the number of people coming into the Zoom rooms or onto their chat spaces, they actually kind of outweighed maybe some of their pre-pandemic numbers. So, was there an expanded reach or not? And we wanted to look at kind of to what extent was this pandemic moment a great opportunity for people to be creative and experiment, or was it just kind of replicating online what they were doing offline? So these were some of the early kind of questions that we were dealing with in those days. So let me share kind of some of those kind of findings that we found from especially leaders' decision-making choices around the pandemic. So first of all, we did, in line with each of the 3 stages of research, we had 3 reports. And I think I'm a media scholar, and media scholars like to say what things, tell what things look like on the package. So we tried to be really kind of clear and concise on what our findings were through the report titles. So report 1 is when pastors put on the tech hat. And this was a kind of a report, but basically saying, how did pastors adopt and adapt to that really first year time. And we talked to them, again, there was a lot of challenges that pastors had to deal with, health and safety regulations, how do you set up, disinfectant stations in your church, to what extent, when is the line between online and offline gathering able to be broached? But from our research, we found that of all the things that they had to do and adapt to, putting on that tech hat, trying to figure out what to do with technology was one of the most challenging and stressful for many of them. In our second report, we're looking at kind of the beginning and end of the funding that they received, mission to serve technology, that they realized that in serving their congregations, they had to kind of change their frame of what it means to be in ministry and when technology comes together. And we found that there was not just issues of kind of a digital divide and for many congregations that they didn't have the resources, but there was a lot of hesitancy. In fact, some congregations even put stumbling blocks in their own way because people in their congregation were kind of dragging their heels into the digital era. And then in the third report, we talk about we're still here, that churches, again, 3 years later, most of them were still open, but we're having to kind of negotiate, do we stay online or do we go offline? Or how do we deal with this technology that we spent a lot of money and a lot of resources into? So let me delve into the key findings. And alongside these 3 major reports, we did a series of 5 what we called tech trend papers. And so this is where we did a deep dive into some of the most interesting findings that we found. And these are what I'm going to talk about in this portion. So one of the biggest challenges early on was that, even when churches settled on a platform and they felt comfortable with it, or when they figured out where to put that camera in the sanctuary and how to best kind of, capture that the liturgical moment, there was a real sense of kind of a string between, what is this really true community? Is this experience of church that we've always had is embodied? Is that mediation, does it strip something? And not just practically, but even theologically. And so there was a lot of conflict in many congregations between leaders and decision makers about the technology, between these newly formed tech teams and kind of pastors, as well as kind of people that originally were really enthusiastic about the technology, but then quickly kind of started to get burned out. So one thing is there was a whole rise, especially in many kind of non-denominational, interdenominational churches, using a lot of high mediation in media was pretty common pre-pandemic. People had been live streaming their services or kind of working with that. But many, again, mainline Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist, Uniting Church, this was quite new. And so the whole idea of creating a tech team became, again, an important thing to do, but also it was kind of it wasn't an easy box to create. Okay, we have the coffee team, we have the service team, maybe the altar guild. What role does this tech team play? Because they're both doing ministry work as well as just very practical work. How do we understand? How do we monitor this? How do we kind of facilitate this? And then again, a lot of people were. There was that energy at the beginning of the pandemic that by the end of 2020 started to fade. So people would be volunteering for maybe even helping out in these tech teams, but that would burnout became very high by the end of 2020, early 2021. So how do we deal with this kind of community and these new resources of community? Another thing that happened was not just the practical side, but just the online experience of when people move their church services online. How do we understand community? There was a lot of theological reflection, with pastors and their staff, with pastors and other pastors, talking about how they were doing worship services. And, so if we move our services online, what are the limits of certain rituals? There was a lot of debate, again, with the Catholic Church and the U.S. and Methodist Church about the idea of communion. The Catholic Church, generally speaking, in North America, settled on the spiritual communion model where the priest would practice on behalf of the congregation. The Methodist Church, actually, in the U.S. felt that was inauthentic, and so they barred churches from actually practicing that. And so there was a lot of ideas like, what does it really mean to be part of the church? So one of the big things was about, many pastors began to say that we have to re-examine how our definition of community and ministry work, because it doesn't map on very cleanly into the digital world. So how do we change our theological as well as our practical understandings? Another thing we found early on is, I had mentioned previously, that the tech hat was very intimidating. Unless, again, you were, there was very few pastors and church leaders that had either like that were did have skills in digital technology or had a member of their board or their presbyter that they could kind of bring on to help them with this. And so many of the skills they felt that they didn't have those basic skills and understanding. And this was especially problematic when they needed to go buy a camera or a digital resource. Many of them didn't realize until that moment that the soundboards they had weren't even compatible with the digital cameras that they went out and bought. So we found that there was a lot of skills that are lacking, and this has become an important conversation between myself and other people that are working in seminaries. To what extent do these digital ministry skills need to become part of mainline training and education? Is it just a workshop that's needed, or is it an actual course in seminary? And if you create a digital technology or ministry course, what gets dropped? Clinical pastoral counseling, that second semester of Greek, These are big questions that are being asked. So, there was a sense of, there was general experience lacking. There was also digital media knowledge, so not knowing what resources, and even just the sense of digital literacy, what in a sense is compatible. Most of the pastors had little to no experience with social media. So even to think of, hey, do I need to be using Facebook or Instagram or YouTube, or how do I even set those things up? So we found that we're in an interesting moment where church leaders and especially training institutions are trying to think about, what does this pandemic, post-pandemic reality say to us about how we train our ministers? What are the essential skills for the 21st century? Another thing, that it wasn't just that pastors didn't have the skills and the practical skills, they also, the traits that they found that were needed but lacking were also kind of character traits. In one of the papers we wrote, we talked about pastors as forced entrepreneurs. They were forced into this digital experience, but the things that you need to be successful in making choices about digital media are maybe not the top traits that you would think about that pastors. Pastors are trained in, homiletics, in, kind of administration skills, maybe in kind of learning how to, in organization, accountability and loyalty. So there was kind of traditional pastoral traits that people were skilled in and they felt comfortable with, but the online leadership traits that required them for the choices they had to make and doing online were traits that are more aligned with entrepreneurship, about creating. So, digital culture is all about beta. Beta testing is the idea is you create something and then you put it out there, knowing it's not fully baked. But how many pastors do you think would feel comfortable or felt comfortable not really knowing exactly how that Zoom platform was going to work or what they needed to do to make sure that YouTube service was successful, and they went out there and problems happened and challenges. So being willing to be creative, willing to be adaptable. Also just being willing to experiment, say, hey, well, maybe we spent money buying this camera, but we realize it's more than we need. Maybe we need to actually, we have a camera and a couple phones, so we have more angles to work from. So being willing to kind of, that idea of being beta testing, of moving on the fly, making changes, trial and error. Again, it's not that pastors don't know how to deal with crises, but it was a different level of kind of learning, especially when you have a liturgical model of a service that's been well established over generations, and you have to change it because of the technology. It became this what we called an uncomfortable repositioning that caused a lot of stress for many, many ministers. Another issue that arose was what we called the digital reluctance. And so, again, many churches quickly learned during the pandemic that they had a digital divide, or they lived in a community with a digital divide. A digital divide is basically the term used when people don't have either access, knowledge, or resources related to the digital. So again, many churches didn't have Wi-Fi access in them. But what was even more challenging than just kind of realizing we don't have these lacks and we need to get up to speed, or we even have to kind of work with our community to get access to the resources we need, was this idea of digital resistance. Digital resistance is when religious leaders actively oppose the use of digital technology. And you would think that, this would be kind of just, maybe older congregation members, but it was really kind of churches that were kind of well established, again, mostly mainline churches, where digital media, streaming the sermon was not kind of something that was common in their church diocese or not, so there wasn't a lot of models for them to go to. So even though they might have actually had resources available to them, whether it was through this grant or their denomination, many churches purposely dug their heels even up till the end of 2020 of getting online services done. And so this was interesting. It kind of talks about a lot about kind of resilience and change. How resilient are we? How flexible are our theological models? How flexible are our leaders in willing to adapt to change? And not just kind of, again, the pastor, but the kind of leadership team that they have around them. So we had this issue of kind of that sometimes it wasn't just the lack of resources, but the people around them that caused a resistance. We also noticed what we call technological hesitancy. And so these are congregations that have primarily older members, 60 plus members. And a lot of those churches would have a sense of like maybe the idea of going online was very intimidating to them. And so there was, again, a little bit slower uptake in that, mostly because either the leaders or congregation members didn't have the skills, or more likely they didn't have access to the technology. But when we looked at that overall, actually the older members that maybe were hesitant about the technology were still faster moving in adapting to change than the leaders who were digitally resistant, which were interesting. There was a lot of really unique models, especially in the US within Hispanic and minority congregations, where like a church would buy like 3 or 4 different iPads, and then they would actually physically take the iPad around to the congregational members during the week so they could watch the recorded TV, church service and engage in that way. Other times, a couple churches would interact with others in their denomination and create one maybe church that was really well wired, and then different pastors would come in during the week and record their sermons and put them online. And so, say, hey, we don't have all the tools, but if we all share our resources, we can create these spaces. And then again, also having some interesting mentorship programs between young people, especially youth pastors, with the older congregations. And so what this shows is that the church, there is definitely opportunities for churches to adapt, and there even in those times where it was really stressful. But the ideological kind of concern about what technology would do almost was more of a problem than actually the access to resources in the long term. And then finally, when thinking about kind of, we're still here, this issue of kind of experimentation and adaptability. How do we prepare, the next generation of pastors and leaders for these tools and resources, not just of the digital, but pastoral ministry? And especially, as churches began to see in 2022 and 23, some of our people are not logging on online. And even when in late 2022 and early 23, some churches were able to kind of create more of a hybrid where people could come back in person and they still kept the online going. How do we kind of bridge the gap between the people who still don't feel comfortable coming in and the people that are online? So there's a sense that kind of, change wasn't just something that happened at one moment or one period. It was this idea of constant change. And can the church be willing to adopt this kind of attitude of being willing to constantly change in creative and ways that encourage flow and not just rigidity? So kind of overall, kind of what were some of the findings that we found in looking at our data? Well, we found that the online experience didn't just raise a lot of practical questions, but it raised a lot of interesting theological and liturgical questions. What does it mean to be a church in the 21st century? What does that not just look like, but how do we act? Many of the pastors that we talked to, and especially looking at the survey data we had, if they would have defined what a church was, they would have said, it's a community of people, but actually what their definition of church was it's a building, it's a gathering, and it happens in a certain space at a certain time. So if you remove that space, that time, and those kind of boundaries, what do you have? And it began to become a very interesting and deep conversations of them rethinking about, well, hey, well, this is what, maybe my idealistic understanding of community is, but how are we actually living out church? How are we actually functioning? Do we need to kind of rethink about how we kind of define ourselves, or just maybe the institutional practices they put into place that create rigidity around these understandings of what community is. So a lot of interesting debates and a lot of religious leaders having to re-examine their understanding of what it means to be part of a community. We also saw a lot of interesting kind of responses in just the idea, what are the limits of the digital for some people? For many of them, it's those theological hard boundaries of if we're Catholic and it's transubstantiation, we can't do an online Eucharist. Where other churches, because of their theological boundaries, well, we can do, but it's just in different ways and redefining. So looking at not just what is acceptable and unacceptable in a community, but what is real or not real. So online ministry is an emerging conversation. In the first 2 years of the pandemic, it was really focused on practical things about how to get your church online and how to do this. But now people are beginning to think, if we move into this era where church is hybrid, where we're live streaming and we have an offline congregation, how do we kind of mix that, and what does that do to our theological flexibility and our traditional theological definitions? So now I'm going to move into looking at kind of not talking about the pandemic, but also how this affected not just Christian congregations, but looking at Jewish congregations. And so this research, again, was done by my colleague of mine who's in Indiana, Rabbi Aaron Spiegel. He used to work for the Center for Congregations, but now he works for this Greater Indianapolis Multi-Faith Alliance, so where he's trying to build bridges between different religious congregations and share resources. And a lot of this actually came out of the pandemic, where they realized that, hey, maybe these groups of churches or these groups of mosques, synagogues had these resources. If we share together, we're going to enrich and enliven each other together. So his particular study was looking over, started in 2023, and he's still gathering data, but is focused mostly on Reformed congregations, which are the more kind of open to kind of mainstream culture. There was some conservative and Reconstructionists. And his survey was on Jewish congregations all over the US, so it's quite diverse. So what were some of the initial things he found? Well, he found in the early days of the pandemic that, the idea of moving online was something actually that maybe that rabbis weren't excited about, but they were willing to do. So he found out that even before the pandemic, about 24% of these congregations had actually been experimenting with kind of, either live streaming certain services or maybe even certain aspects of their community life and resources, especially like online trainings related to kind of bar mitzvahs and bet mitzvahs or religious education. But 85% of the congregations basically went on fully online for some period, and those 85% also continued to do into the third year of the pandemic, keep being online. And he found that, when they invested in these online services, it was really about not just kind of always live streaming, but it also was thinking about how do we live stream other platforms. So 52% reported that having online meetings either some of the time or a lot of the time. So again, while it was live streaming the services, they also began to quickly say, hey, we also need to keep other aspects of our community life together. And actually, there was a much more kind of, there was a quicker uptake within the Jewish congregations to, again, live stream religious education, religious community activities more readily than even in some of the congregations I found. Part of this is, it's a religious tradition that's had to adapt under times of crisis and stress. And so, the pandemic for them just was one more time. So what were they doing online versus in person? Well, we found that, religious education for children, that interestingly, it was either happening kind of face-to-face or not at all. So only 24% of them actually did online and in-person training. So, so interesting that young people that were really kind of struggling during the pandemic didn't have maybe that religious education or especially training. Bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah training was put on hold during the pandemic. But we did find religious education for adults had a huge uptake. And so there was a lot of sense of kind of, many Jewish congregations began to model what we see in kind of Protestant, especially evangelical Christianity, of the small group. The idea, let's have a book group or let's have a small group that gathers online. So we see a lot of kind of experimentation and the adults more willing to do that rather than them trying to adapt that for kind of children's practices. We see that kind of, for when it came to programs for seniors, 39% were trying to do them online, offline, while, 30% also just said, well, hey, we're just going to stop this for right now. And finally, we said that fellowship and community building was another area that they felt like, okay, if we're going to have community, we need to have gathered places. And so a lot of traditional community events and kind of religious holidays got really truncated or kind of not celebrated in their fullness during the pandemic because of the sense that these needed to be embodied practices. But all this is to say that there was some really interesting kind of playing back and forth of congregations, their willingness or their kind of hesitancy to kind of adapt traditional programs to online practices. We also found that, well, Aaron found that the technology used during the pandemic had a positive impact on Jewish congregations. That generally speaking, that there was less resistance from kind of rabbis as well as kind of leaders in picking this up. And they also saw that the average, while the average median dropped during the pandemic, that there was actually an increase in some sorts from the pre-pandemic. So interestingly, the congregations that were people that maybe had, because of patterns of life, had maybe fallen away from regular religious practice, except during the religious holidays, they started to come back for weekly services when they were webcast. And this recorded increase is the first kind of increase, at least in Jewish congregational data that we've seen in the US in the last 40 years. So in many ways, we could say the pandemic, at least for Jewish congregations, was a hugely positive experience. That doesn't mean every church was robust and always online and offline. That doesn't mean that every person in the congregations was embracing of it, but there was a lot more kind of willingness, and that willingness to experiment proved positive in the overall rate. So we see basically between 2020 to 2023, we saw 33% of the congregations saw a growth of over 25%. And that's huge, especially when we're looking at Protestant churches in the US that were seeing a 20 to 40% drop during the pandemic and post the pandemic. And this rate is continued into 2024. So what does this say about the Jewish congregations? Well, it says that we see a more willingness to embrace digital, and it had a very positive impact on the Jewish congregations. So we see, unless we add in the online, then there was an increase from the attendance of pre-pandemic. So we're seeing basically they haven't lost as many people, and they've actually gained people in the pre-pandemic experience. And many people credit that we, from talking to Aaron and some of the interviews he's done, they said that the pandemic was what brought me back to the community. I saw, the impact of loneliness during the pandemic, and the digital helped me kind of bridge that gap to come back. So now what do we do with all this? So I want to kind of spend a little time just highlighting a few more facts and statistics from our research, and then kind of talk about where we might go from here and what this might mean for the future of religious institutions, especially in the US. So first of all, and this data is coming from our final survey looking at 2023 and how churches adopted. So we found that kind of, if we look pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic, there was a huge uptake in social media. So if you can look at it on the left-hand side of the screen, this is pre-pandemic, that aqua column, that means basically none. So there's very few churches live streaming their services, whereas we see post-pandemic, pandemic a lot. And so we had over 70% of churches, at least for some time, were live streaming. And over half of the congregations are still live streaming their services post the pandemic. So live streaming was a huge take-up. We also saw a huge take-up on Facebook. So again, we see the largest column on Facebook for the pre-pandemic. That is basically saying some of them had Facebook, but many of them, and Facebook was the most popular platform that was used, especially by religious leaders between 50 and older. Interestingly, if we looked at pastors and church leaders, if they were between the ages of 30 to 50, they were more spending time on Instagram, which kind of is in tune with the younger generation being more using Threads and Instagram. But again, Facebook became one, not just a kind of an add-on, but seen as an integral part of kind of creating interest and conversation around the online services. We also saw that there's a move, not just in what they did with technology, but just in their values. And so if we look at these two graphs are kind of trying to speak about how people's and churches move from either negative and neutral views of technology to much more positive views of technology. So pre-pandemic, we see that kind of like, how do you see your relationship between religion and technology, or your church and technology? Well, 37% said we're connected somewhat, or somewhat connected. Whereas after in 2023, we see connected and necessary being very integral. Went from 7% necessary to 33% necessary. So again, moving much more positive, basically being forced to engage with the technology had a positive impact on how they saw technology, rather than as an adversary or necessary evil, but actually as something to enhance worship and ministry. And we also found that during the COVID pandemic, it also altered not just their view of technology, but just what the relationship between the church and technology is. So kind of before the pandemic, we see on one side that, did the pandemic alter? And they said changed in most ways. So 36% and 21%, over half said that it changed our view and leaning toward positive ways. How do you rate it? More positive to mostly positive views. And so again, we see a shift in kind of toward more positive views in technology. So what does this say about congregations? They were willing to engage. When they were willing to engage with technology, it changed their way about their attitude toward technology, how they saw it as a ministry resource, as well as how it could be used to build community overall and in general. And this was similar also with the kind of what we saw within looking at the a hybrid synagogue kind of data. We found that synagogues take on technology. If we look at in 2000, it was very low. By 2020, we saw a really high adoption in take-up. And it was positive in two ways. One is because they saw a huge noted increase in online participation. And 53% of congregations actually tracked their online attendance during the pandemic, which is interesting. And maybe that's why they saw so much of a positive increase. But they saw the importance of kind of paying attention to how this was a factor in the pandemic. But they also saw people not just using it for online services. There was a huge uptick in Ask the Rabbi. So either signaling people to kind of these online websites that are available, where people could ask religious or theological questions and ask spiritual guidance, or a lot of rabbis kind of offering once a month or even once a week questions on whether it's the pandemic or just questions on religious law. So the idea of the rabbis were willing to experiment and try these out as a way to kind of enhance their outreach to the community. But there's still a sense that, kind of, even though there was this high uptake, there still was a group of kind of rabbis that's saying, hey, we're doing this, but we're doing this because we have to. And again, not everyone is staying. There's still about a 30% group of where they did go online, and now they're no longer online during the pandemic. And so there's a sense that, the hybrid is maybe the new normal, but there's still this sense of longing for the old normal, and which is very much echoes, some of the changes we saw in that. So where does this take us? So if we look at kind of how the impact on Jewish congregations and we look at Christian congregations, we see that the move from hybrid and online worship is viewed as not just a natural progression, but acceptable. So we're still here in the 2024 seeing high uptakes of both Jewish congregations and Christian congregations streaming. Some of that is we've seen, especially in the Christian congregations, it's the idea of wise stewardship, I would call the narrative. We spent all this money and we spent all this time training people, we might as well keep it going. What can it hurt? And for in the Jewish congregations, the narrative has been, we saw the positive uptake in adding to the congregation, why would we want to stop that? So there's a sense of that, we need to keep this going. And so for some, hybrid is framed as an opportunity. But it's interesting, especially in some of the Christian congregations, we see that the hybrid strategy of having usually offline traditional service and then streaming that or having some complementary online is seen as a survival strategy. Many of these pastors that are seeing 20 to 40% of people not coming back said the only way we're going to be able to keep people is kind of like we now have to give them this opportunity. And that's kind of a double-edged sword where they feel like we feel this responsibility, we have to keep our online services going, and we feel but we're not really happy about that. Again, more of a generally positive view within the Jewish congregations than in the Christian congregations. But surprisingly, even though churches spent lots of money, lots of time, lots of training, there's still a lot of lacks in technology. Technology moves really quickly. So you buy a camera in 2020, it's already out of date in 2024. And it's the question about, do we need all those fancy new bells and whistles, or actually by not keeping our camera up to date, is it going to impact the quality of our Zoom, just how well the technology flows together? So many leaders, both in Jewish and in Christian congregations, saying, hey, we still need access to resources to help us stay up to date. We need continued training, and we need actually people to mentor us to help us make these choices, because we realize technology is not just a one-stop shop where you make a choice and that's good for the next 20 years. It's not like the same thing as if you make the choice about the pulpit or taking the pews in and out. And also especially with church attendance seeing this huge decline and this congregation disaffiliation, many people say that hybrid, there needs to be more invested in hybrid, just for the sense of that if we don't keep the people somehow, we're going to lose, and those people are not coming back. There's been some churches, been a research study that came out, it's called The Great Dechurching in the US, and it was a couple pastors with a sociologist kind of looked at some of the data and said, oh, well, these people are taking a time out, but they'll be back. We know they'll be back. There's no data to suggest that I think that's a hope and a prayer rather than a reality. And especially, in 2020, before the pandemic, early 2020, Scott Thuma, who's part of the Faith Congregation Study, which does most of the statistics about U.S. congregations, the average church size in the U.S. was 85. People. And we often think about with the churches in America, it's these big mega churches. No, 70% of churches in the US are kind of these under 100, and 85 was the number. But in 2024, 4 years later, 63. So I know there's only 12 people, but if you have a small congregation, those 12 people, that's the person who makes the coffee, that's the person who vacuums the sanctuary. Those are key people. And from another research study that I'm doing on Duns, we're finding out who are those people that are not coming back. It's women between the ages of 50 and 60, at least in America, who are the backbone of did all the service work in the churches, which is a significant thing. So to wrap this up, basically we're in this very interesting time for congregations. We're seeing a lot of opportunities, and I think, and my hope is for churches to basically take the great digital experiment that we're all forced into as an opportunity to kind of rethink what church should look like and could look like. Also to think about what a long-term hybrid strategy could do, not just in the sense of survival, but also as a way of complementing what churches have been doing for generations of trying to build community together and support. Will hybrid delay the loss of churches in the next 30 years in America? My gut says no, but at least it gives them another space in which to connect, which I think is important. And I think that we're in this new space, both for many different faith traditions, this idea of what does the hybrid congregation look like. There's a term that's been used by Luciano Floridi, who is an information ethicist, and he says that we don't really live online or offline anymore. We live what he calls on life. We're always on. My device is recording this talk as we're saying. So we're always kind of engaging in the digital. So we need to think about how do we live and how do we be church, how do we be congregational support spaces in that online consistency. Because again, as more and more younger generations come up, they're going to expect that digital to be a seamless flow. And if churches don't take on the lessons that we've learned and spent a lot of time investing over the pandemic, it will be not just a loss, but it could be the loss of many churches and communities in the years to come. So thank you.